I'm Karen Brewster, and today is June 9th, 2009, and I'm here in Anchorage with John Morrison, and we're in the offices of the Department of Fish and Game here in Anchorage, and this is for the Wildlife Society's Conserving Our Wildlife Heritage Conservation Project, something like that. And also joining us is Todd Rinaldi of the Fish and Game Department and the Wildlife Society. So Todd, if you have any questions you want to ask as we go along, just pipe in. Okay? You ready?
Ready.
Okay. And get off camera. So, John, why don't we start by you telling us when and where you were born and your growing up.
Yeah, okay.
How you got into being a wildlife professional.
Well, I was born in Wichita, Kansas, 1924. And was raised in a family that was quite outdoors oriented. My dad was quite a hunter. He had come from Ireland and right after the First World War, in which he was a soldier for the British Army. But he had an uncle, a Scot, who had a farm near Wichita, and my dad was an apprentice on the Irish Railroad when he was young, and after he got out of the British Army, he came over to Wichita to try to find work, and which he did in the railroad roundhouse there as a worker. But he spent a lot of time with his uncle Jim Davidson on his farm outside of Wichita ways. And when I became big enough, I used to go out and hike along with him, rabbit hunting in the fall, and became quite intrigued with all of that. I got quite interested in birds, and I finally think I knew just about every bird in the state of Kansas, and that led on into further, more wider interest when I got into Boy Scouts, for example. We had a lot of activities outdoors and or wildlife oriented, and I got my own shotgun and became a hunter along with my dad and old Uncle Jim. And as I progressed on into late teens, my friends, both in Scouts and high school, we did a lot of hunting together. And I had a high school biology teacher, Ruth Heil, a marvelous teacher, a great lady, who was quite interested in the students' interests in whatever. And she soon recognized how strongly interested I was in wildlife in general. And when I mentioned to her about I was interested in doing some kind of work with that line, and she really guided me along pretty well into that and made me aware of some of the opportunities. Well, by the time I was a senior, the Second World War was on, and so I went to the Merchant Marine. They had a recruiting bunch come to town. They were desperately short of merchant seamen at that time, so many ships were getting torpedoed and lost, So all the time, though I was at sea, I kept thinking about someday I want to get back to school. And when I finally did get out of the Merchant Marine and I went to Montana, 1946 this was, where my dad's cousin and her husband had a ranch, and they're in the Clark Fork Valley with mountains all around, deer, elk, everything you could think of that would really turn on a wildlife interested person, So I went up there and thought, well, this is where I want to come back to, but I needed to go back to sea a couple more trips and save some more money, which I did. But got back there in 47 and was working in the woods as a logger and sawmiller worker and trying to save up money to get to the university in Missoula. While I was in the Army, I wrote to a lot of schools about getting into a wildlife program. And I thought, well, that's natural to go to the university. At that time, it was Montana State University, and then Bozeman had Montana State College. But in later years, they made Missoula into the university, and Bozeman into Montana State University then. But while I was waiting to do that, I got drafted, even though I'd been in the Merchant Marine during the Second World War and spent a lot of time out in the Southwest Pacific. So I went to the engineer school at Fort Belvoir and became a surveyor, and still kept thinking about I've got to get back there to get into that wildlife program, And so in 1950, I finally got shed out of the first hitch in the Army and went back to Wichita and went to work for the telephone company for a little bit, where I met my wife. We've now been married 58 years.
Wow.
But
Congratulations.
I'm still trying to save up enough money to get back up to Montana. My wife, of course, would be going with me. And I got called back out of the reserves because of the Korean War. But I was fortunate that I thought I didn't have to go to Korea. I got over to Japan, where they had the shipping points from, and they saw my MOS number, Military Occupational Specialty number, 227 Surveyor. Oh, we got a bigger priority for you down in the Philippines, so flew me down to Luzon. But at any rate, when I finally got out of all of that and got back home, and my wife and I bought a little car and headed for Missoula. And finally got into the wildlife program there and got started. And really quite stimulating, because there's the faculty there, many of them are very outdoor oriented as well. A lot of hunters and fishermen among them, and in their wildlife research and study interest, they made a real live program out of it. And so I got acquainted with quite a few of the biologists there in the state, and because there was opportunities to work part-time for the state and summer jobs, and even in during school terms, I got into one trapping ducks out in the Clark Fork Valley and banding them, and later in the summertime I did a lot of mapping of waterfowl habitat up the Bitterroot Valley, which was quite a good experience. And then got acquainted with Dr. John Craighead, that at that time was leader of the wildlife research unit there. He hired a bunch of us to go up in the Flathead Valley in the spring and summer to monitor Canada goose nesting up there and brood raising, and this was a big project he had. So that was quite educational, both academically as well as outdoors. And ever after that experience, as I went all the way through the rest of my career, I always thought that it is extremely valuable for any wildlife student, if at all possible, to get into some kind of part-time work while they're doing the academic things. The one thing that finally came out of all that, I stayed on with Craighead and the unit, did my master's degree with elk reproduction at the National Bison Range, where I got even wider exposure to how wildlife agencies and organizations work, and how things are done, what's important, what are the objectives, what are the problems, and you become more and more aware of all of this as you go along. But
can I interrupt for a second to ask on the research you did on the reproductive issues with elk?
Elk, wapiti.
For somebody who is not a biologist like me, can you talk about how you do that kind of research? What you were trying to figure out?
What I did with these elk, they have a lot of elk running free on the National Bison Range. This is, I think it was 11,000 acre refuge, National Wildlife Refuge. But the people that worked there were quite skillful in rounding up these animals. The range had several areas that are fenced off, and by carefully moving these animals, the bison in the fall they round up to pick out the ones they're going to slaughter to sell, and the live ones to sell to places. They also would round up these elk if wanted. And I got quite a sizable group, 2 years in a row, I got sizable groups of cow elk. And we started off with a bull we trapped that was we vasectomized. He could indicate which cows were coming into estrus. And when we had pretty much established the breeding time of the onset, we got another bull that was still intact, and I had them trained eventually. I'd let the bull in with the cows in the daytime, and if any of them were in estrus, he would mate with them. They were all marked where you could identify the cows. In the evening, when it became dark, I trained that bull to get out of there, which was not too easy a job, but finally it worked. He had his own separate pen all night, back in again the next day. And I had a little shed with a little heater. This was getting pretty cold. And I would watch any of the copulations that took place and recorded the time and place. Well, then after a certain period of time, we then had cows with, we hoped, embryos at different stages of gestation. on up to the time of parturition. But I sacrificed those cows at those different periods and got the embryos and the ovaries. And my research then was on the growth rate of the fetuses, the embryos and fetuses. This study was induced by a curiosity or a concern about some states in the West that had elk hunting were afraid that by having the hunt on during the mating season when the elk and the bulls are really bugling and things are going on, they felt that hunting might disturb that and interfere with their reproduction. But what the research showed that I did was that all of the bugling and the carrying on of the bulls really proceeds when they actually are doing the mating and conceiving. So there was a time separation there. But the Wildlife Society had a wildlife handbook that has published that my embryonic growth curve has been published in that for a while. But also, along with that, I analyzed the ovaries of the cows to correlate the different stages of development of the egg cells and the corpora lutea that form after ovulation and fill in that big cavity where the ovum was. But I began to realize then that, and I've been looking a lot at the ideas of management, not just the research, but the fact that this research that I did had an impact on the management of elk and the hunting seasons especially. You don't get into this kind of work just to be a job. You've got to have some feeling, an aim, a reason that drives you on. You're not going to do this for a paycheck. And the more I went along, I went from there to Idaho to get a job and worked with primarily elk there in the central Idaho area. But there I learned a lot about dealing with the management agencies, the responsible agencies, not only the state fish and game, but the other federal and state agencies we interacted with. I also began getting a real good initiation into dealing with the public, because the public is just full of all kinds of opinions affecting wildlife that usually don't really have a darn thing to do with understanding what the problems are and what needs to be done about it. In those days, it was mostly self-styled experts in what we call the God and Run clubs, the rod and gun clubs. All these guys, well, I've been hunting so-and-so place for 35 years. I guess I know something about this. I had a heck of a run-in with famous Elmer Keith at a meeting of the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association one time. Old Elmer's, of course, quite an author about guns. Also, he'd been a guide hunter and had a very opinionated idea about the way that eagles were knocking off the bighorn sheep lambs in the Middle Fork of the Salmon River. And me, with my new master's degree and all my big expertise that I had learned at school, said, well, history kind of shows that that's all been going on for thousands of years, and we really don't need to get that concerned about the eagles eating a few of those bighorn sheep lambs. Boy, did he ever tear me apart. So I thought, well, now maybe I better check into things a little more here before I blow off my opinions at these kind of meetings with these old timers that really know the ropes. But in school and thereafter, shortly thereafter, we'd had a lot of letters from these people then called anti-vivisectionists, really cursing us and threatening us and damning us for experimenting with animals. Of course, we had a big statue of them we laughed at. Ultimately, this all grew into the animal rights organizations that really went to town on us. They got a lot of money, of course, and still have. So you have to learn how to deal with those kind of people. You have to learn how to deal with commercial interests. There are all kinds of opinions out there and desires and special interests that want to do something that somehow or another is related to wildlife and affected by what we do with wildlife. The general public doesn't really understand much of this one way or the other. They want to have nice parks and wildlife to watch. They've been affected by the TV shows, Flipper and Gentle Ben and all of Walt Disney stuff, And they think, well, everything's going along okay until some big thing blows up. And then they really don't know what to do about it. And it became more and more of a realization to me that we had to learn as much about people as we did about the wildlife. And as I progressed on, in my wildlife work there in Idaho, I got into an awful lot of a good experience in field work as well as in dealing with people, and I also became aware of the great need for more research on different things that we were concerned with.
Such as?
The habitat quality in the winter range got to be, quickly became one of my biggest concerns, so I had to take my botanical knowledge that I'd picked up, and I set up a lot of transects on browse samples. We'd mark browse bushes and measure the annual growth just before the fall, and then we'd, next spring, measure how much the animals had eaten off of it. And do the statistical analysis on this. Pellet group counts, where you set out a marked area and then you count the amount of defecations that have occurred on it. And somebody had done the research to show how many times a day a mule deer or an elk or whatever drops a bunch of pellets, and you get from that an indication of the usage intensity. A lot of other questions came up about movement, migration, winter to summer range and back. The impact of logging became quite a question. Dams and their flooding of winter range. What do the animals do when their winter range is flooded up? These are examples of many things that became questions that needed more work done on it.
Well, it sounds like a lot of the questions in the research are driven by management issues and needs.
At that point. And still at the same time, we were working with the University of Idaho, the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit, and still with the Montana unit, where we could see that there was a need for more basic research on things. The Idaho unit had quite a study up in the Lochsaw drainage on the use of salt by elk and the impact that had then on surrounding vegetation, and how the elk, how their movements were made in relation to different things they did at different times of the year and coming to those salt blocks. You've probably heard of Morris Hornacher, who studies various kinds of felines. He started with mountain lions in the Big Creek area, which is a tributary of the Middle Fork of the Salmon River in Idaho. He came to me when I was a biologist based in McCall, wondered about going into that country to do studies on mountain lions. So I turned him on to a fellow that lived down in Big Creek, a bachelor down there, Wilbur Wiles, who really knew the area and really knew the wildlife. And I got Morris to meet with Wilbur, and boy, they made quite a team, and that got Morris started off pretty good on all of the relationships he's had with felines in different countries. A lot of stuff he's done with tigers in Siberia in more recent years, you've probably heard of. At any rate, I was quite more research-oriented, frankly. The management I enjoyed getting out with a pack string. I learned how to load mules and and that sort of thing. Flew helicopters, airplanes on censuses and things. And by the time I was pretty well into it all, the Western Association, or the Western Division of the Wildlife Society, had its annual meeting in Missoula, and I went back over there to give a paper on my elk work. There I met Helmut Buchner, who was professor of biology at Washington State University, and he came right up and he says, I've got National Science Foundation grant to study this Uganda cob antelope in Africa, and part of the project would require doing just what you did with those elk. Would you be interested in going with me on that? He said you come to Washington State University and you get a stipend, and you can also work on your doctorate. I really went for it and never regretted it.
It's a hard offer to turn down.
It really, well, at that point, I was...
What year was that?
I'm sorry?
What year was that?
That would have been 1960 or 61. Yeah, 61. I went back to a school in Missouri, in Pullman, Washington State University. By then I had 3 kids.
So you went to Africa by yourself, or did your
family
go with you?
I was part of the party.
But did your family go?
Oh no. No, my wife at that time had gotten a job on the campus as the assistant to the director of the radio station in the communications department. You remember Edgar Murrow, famous? He was a student there years and years ago. But she also had her own little radio show that she set up, a barter bureau, and people would give her slips of information to put on the air about they wanted to buy or sell something. So she and the kids stayed home while I went to Africa for the summer of 1962. And
what was that like? What was Africa like?
Oh, marvelous. Uganda was really great in those days. Higher elevation, so the climate was really nice. And the people were all great. The country, everything about it was that time. It was just before they got independence from English rule. In fact, I had finished my work there and gone back to Pullman when Uganda got its independence. And immediately, as a whole lot of tribal fighting broke out that the British had kept suppressed. Dr. Buechner and his family were there, plus a couple of Swiss behaviorists, Walter Leuthold and Robert Schlerth, who Schlerth was the director of the Swiss National Parks. And both were quite expert at animal behavior. And the Uganda cob antelope had this territorial meeting ground. That was the basis of Buechner's interest, to understand how that affected their productivity. And at the same time, the Uganda government had planned to put a road right through this area where they had all these territorial mating grounds to service a commercial fishing place they wanted to put up on Lake Albert, one of the big lakes in that chain. So I got quite well acquainted there, more acquainted with behavior than I had been before, as well as having collected quite a bunch of female cob. We had captured and marked a tremendous number of them. We immobilized them with immobilizing drug, succinylcholine chloride, with a dart gun. And also we captured quite a batch of the bucks, the males, and painted their horns and put ear tags on them so we could identify them.
You weren't able to corral them like you were in Montana.
No, we had to use the immobilizing system.
And was immobilization and that
paralyzes them.
Yeah, was that new technology at the time?
Fairly new. We had a colleague at the university in Nairobi who was specializing in that work. And we had quite a lot of help from him. This drug we were getting was made in England. Sucostrin was their brand name. And it worked quite well. It was one of the earliest of those immobilizing drugs. Many better ones were made later on, but that one did just fine. And that enabled us to get quite a few animals captured and marked so that we could then identify who was doing what with them. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the Uganda government got into a cropping program there. There was a cattle interest wanted to get the Semliki wildlife refuge we were working in, the Semliki Plains, and fill it full of cattle. And Fish and Game Department, a lot of other people didn't want to do that. They wanted to maintain it just like it was. So as a sop to the cattle interests, the meat market interest is what was basically it. They started sacrificing, collecting, killing a whole bunch of cob and selling them in the meat markets. So that enabled us to get more reproductive information out of them. I got quite a few complete female reproductive tracts that we immediately put in formalin and then shipped the whole batch of it back to University of Wisconsin Medical School. And I got back to Pullman and did another fall semester of studies and so forth, and then took the spring semester and went back to Madison, Wisconsin, where I worked in the laboratory of Harlan Mossman, who was at that time the world's leading expert on mammalian reproductive systems, anatomy. And so I analyzed all of this material that we had gotten from these cob for a whole semester in his lab till I really got the hang of things, and I took a whole bunch more back to Pullman with me, where I continued sectioning ovaries and measuring embryos. Discovered quite an interesting phenomenon in their uterus that one horn, bovids and other ruminants have a forked uterus, horned, two horns, cornuate, and the right one was highly atrophied. And all of the fetuses, single fetus, were always in the left horn of the uterus. But then I realized that in analyzing all this, they were still ovulating out of the right ovary, but the ovum would go around into the left horn to be fertilized and then develop. At any rate, that was quite a big benefit. And while I was there at Pullman, too, and part of my coursework was in the veterinary school, where they had some real experts on ruminant reproduction. So by the time I got finished up there, Buchner was moving out and going to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where he took over their research program. And at the same time, he was at a meeting where he met Carl Kofort, another fairly famous biologist in those days. Did a big monograph on the guanaco or something down in South America, I forget now. At any rate, at that time, he was in charge of the primate program with the Public Health Service in Puerto Rico, where they had these rhesus monkeys on 2 islands that doing all kinds of studies with mainly behavioral. But this was part of the Laboratory of Perinatal Physiology, which is part of the National Institutes of Health, a neurological institute for Institute of Neurological Diseases and Blindness, which is part of the Public Health Service. At any rate, Kofort said he was looking for somebody to come down there and take over a research program, and Buchner says, I got just a guy for you. So I got into that and finished my PhD, and my family and I all moved down to Puerto Rico and stayed there a couple of years while I supervised the research on these, going on with these rhesus monkey troops, or groups of social groups that are antagonistic to each other. A lot of things there that looked at and did a lot of observations on recording the behavior. Had a lot of visiting scientists. I had a Puerto Rican crew that I supervised that took care of all of the facilities. We had boats to get out to the islands and back, and had quite a hookup with the university eventually, especially their campus at Mayagüez on the west end of the island, which is a branch of the main university in San Juan. But I would go back and forth between the place where I lived and the west coast, the east coast of Puerto Rico, or Cayo Santiago was the island that had these groups on that I worked mostly with, but we also had them on some islands of La Parguera, southwest Puerto Rico, where we had more intensive behavioral research under controlled circumstances. There we had big compounds made, and I had a couple of biologists that worked for me there who did some real good observations on how these animals interacted. We got into their physiology. We had radio transmitters that would transmit their heart rate, blood pressure, and everything when they would interact with each other. And this was particularly important in the dominance hierarchy understandings. But at any rate,
What was the overall purpose of studying these rhesus monkeys? What were people trying to figure out or want to know?
Just mostly basic research on their social behavior. At the same time, we're allied with the laboratory in San Juan, where they would get monkeys and take them in there to do various medical studies with. The laboratory director did a lot of work with stillbirth children, and they would affect these monkeys in a way to induce different problems with the pregnant females' gestation.
So it was to try and make some parallels with human medical needs and things?
Yeah, to be able to manipulate what was going on and see just what was affecting what. This was interesting to me because my next youngest brother died of that in childbirth, and subsequently my existing brother was born, and he's still okay. But there's a whole lot of things that they did there also with neurology. They had several people are experts in brain function. In fact, our laboratory director, Ron Myers, his specialty was splitting the brain, inserting a plastic shield between the two hemispheres of the brain to see how that affected physiology and behavior and so forth and learning. I had a Hindu fellow from India that was at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore come down, and we did some studies together. There are a lot of simian viruses in India where they have these huge population of these things, viruses that affect people, much like Ebola and in Africa, and HIV, So he came down and drew quite a lot of blood from several of the animals, and we worked those up into some analyses and publications. By the time I got down there for 2 years, I began to realize it was kind of difficult for the family living in a whole different culture, different language and all. I didn't have much trouble with it. I knew some Spanish. I'd taken it in high school, and I learned quite a bit more in the merchant marine from Central American seamen that we had on the ships. But I got along okay with that. And I had good crew. A lot of the guys that worked for me had been in the 165th Infantry Regiment, a Puerto Rican National Guard that fought in Korea, and they were very mature, very capable people. That expedited things a lot. But I got the opportunity. I went to the North American Wildlife Conference. I think it was in Pittsburgh that year, and I met the fellow that was head of all of the cooperative wildlife research units. He said, "Say, we're needing a couple of unit leaders, one in South Dakota and another one in Stillwater, Oklahoma." But he said, "I think they've already got kind of picked out who they want for South Dakota." He said, "Would you be interested in the one in Oklahoma?" And I said, "Well, I think maybe it's time for me to move." I really wanted to get back into a broader version of wildlife. I enjoyed learning about primates. Met a lot of people in primatology and scientists at different meetings and read their literature and all. Had a lot of them come there as visiting scientists. One of the most famous in Europe, Irinaus Ibisfeld, a German who was at the Max Planck Institute. And he had done a lot of research on how aggressive behavior in mammals has evolved into the reproductive behavior, the mating behavior. And
it seems like with the monkeys and your work with the elk originally, you were talking about the animal rights groups and doing research on animals and how that. Now I don't know that same kind of research is done that way, is it?
I don't know,
animal
really.
Animal rights influenced.
I just don't know what they've. I got out of the primatology pretty much, and I don't even look at their literature. When I got back to
so you went to Oklahoma.
Oklahoma there, I really turned away and got into a whole lot of new things there. I realized right off at the bat when I got there that I was going to have some problems. The zoology department had a wildlife program with master's degree and PhD, and they had some pretty good faculty members. But the department chairman and his big sidekick, a zoology professor named Brian Glass, who was quite a prominent mammologist, he was secretary of the Mammalogy Society for decades. They were both fairly strong Baptists, and they made a point of the fact they didn't believe in evolution. Now, the department chairman was a fish embryologist, and how the devil he could be that and do research and all and still run a zoology department and still be a creationist. I couldn't handle that. But so we did not get along too well at first. But the thing that really bugged me was they really had no good wildlife program. They'd gotten one wildlife professor who specifically was wildlife, but they had quite a collection of other faculty members that looked on different aspects of biology, you know. They wanted right off the bat this big thing about more freshman bachelor degree. They didn't have a bachelor degree program. I pointed out you can't do that unless you've got master degree and you've got a program for a PhD, which was one of my main responsibilities, was guiding graduate students in those wildlife programs. So I finally made them realize, okay, we got to say we've got a bachelor's degree. You can get a bachelor's degree here, not come here and try to study wildlife and then get a zoology degree or what have you, you're going to have a wildlife degree, you know. So I had a pretty good comrade there, and the one guy they'd hired to be the wildlife teacher, Bob Smith, who was a waterfowl man. And I got a good assistant unit leader too, Jim Lewis, who came from the Tennessee Fish and Game Department. And we sat down and did a lot of thinking and talking, and we not only designed this bachelor's program, but we also designed it in 3 parts. By that time, I had gotten a broad enough and a deep enough understanding of what I believed it took to make a good wildlife biologist, to tell what kind of education they could get. And at the same time, I realized that people had different ways of wanting to work in wildlife. So we set up a 3-part bachelor's program, a research focus, a management focus, and an information and education focus. And that meant for each one of those areas, we would have a coursework pattern that would fit that. The information people would go to the public affairs and journalism and so forth. The management would go to forestry and some of that, and the research guys would keep pretty much in-house, and they'd pick up more in the way of research techniques and basic stuff. At the same time, we realized that all of them, if they're going to deal with wildlife, they got to have enough overall education in the basics to be able to talk about it intelligently and work with it intelligently. People in management have got to understand what it takes for animals to adapt to different kinds of habitat and how they can be affected by different forces. The I&E people have got to know how to communicate. But what are they going to communicate, and how do they do it? They've got to understand wildlife intelligently before they can explain it to the public or anybody else and make sense. So that worked out pretty well, and I was there 8 years. I had a lot of good graduate students. I went into a lot of good jobs. One of my best PhD students was up here for a while, Gerald Garner, that did a lot of research on polar bears, did his PhD with me. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago. And Jim Lewis, my assistant, went on to he did his PhD with me also, and went on to become unit leader in Georgia, set up a new unit there. But at any rate, well, another real interesting student I had, a master's degree student, was part Sioux Indian girl. She's born in Dakota but raised down there in southeastern Oklahoma, and did a real good master's study on comparing the nutritional quality of vegetation in areas they were clear-cutting, logging down there, compared to the still standing virgin forest. So she did a lot of chemical analyses and that. She went into the Fish and Wildlife Service as I&E person on the Bosque del Apache refuge in southern New Mexico. Went right up the ladder. She's been big-time assistant regional director in Minnesota and done a lot of the good things in Washington, D.C. But I finally, after about 8 years there, had come to a very set ideas about what wildlife is all about and what we got to do to function in it effectively.
And now, was that the late 60s, early 70s? Is that about?
Yeah, I got to Stillwater in 65. No, wait a minute. I went to Puerto Rico in 65, to Stillwater in 67, and then I went from there to Fort Collins, Colorado, and helped set up another function in the Fish and Wildlife Service. While I was at Stillwater as a unit leader, I was a Fish and Wildlife Service employee, but I was assigned to the university as an adjunct professor, and I had all the responsibilities of a regular faculty member, and which was good, because I had to be an assistant professor, almost a professor, to get started, so that I was qualified to handle the graduate students. Right. And about halfway through there, they made me a full professor then. But I left there, went for a couple of years in Fort Collins to help set up the Western Energy and Land Use team. Now, a lot of new ways of developing energy was going on in the West at that time, and a lot of the agencies who were regulators, and a lot of the commercial organizations that were doing the development were confused and not too certain about what do we do about the environmental impact analyses. What do we need to know, and where do we find out, and who's got the stuff, you know.
So this was before the National Environmental Protection Act?
About the time it started.
Okay.
It was getting quite important to do these environmental impact analyses. And the joke was at that time, well, what they're doing are laundry lists. They list all of the plants and all of the animals and hand that in, and that's supposed to suffice. Well, it doesn't tell anything about the interaction between these different functions, these different compositions. The thing that they were missing out on was ecology. And to this day, I still believe that of all the things that wildlifer needs to really get a good understanding of, it's ecology. Adaptation to the environment. To know the difference between environment as just a collection of things there and an ecosystem in which information and energy has entered and makes all this stuff start acting and doing things and being subject and vulnerable to other things interfering with them, like we can do with commercial interests and whatever. Things that people do mainly, as well as what natural forces like volcanoes and
forest fires,
earthquakes and all this stuff, you know. You got to understand that people are involved in every darn bit of this thing we call ecology, that they're impacting it one way or another, whether they know it or not. Wildlifers sometimes have to deal with wildlife diseases affecting livestock and poultry and crops, and other times we're concerned about these species that are brought in that are harmful to the native species. All of this stuff gets very complicated, of course, but it's still something we've got to understand. And the only way you can understand it is to do good study and good research. And it came to realize, a lot of us, that most biologists, all of us, no matter who we are, about every few years we need to get retrained. You can do that as we go along, which we did a lot of in the Fish and Wildlife Service with periodic workshops we would go to. I went to workshops all over the West and back east even, where new things coming up would be covered especially. New techniques, new concepts, the description and understanding of new problems that arise. We began to have more and more difficulty dealing with the animal rights people, for example, were becoming more involved in everything. Still, the old-timer class was still there trying to tell us what to do according to what they knew from their futile attempts to shoot an elk somewhere and couldn't find one because they were just driving the road and the elk were all about 4 miles up the mountain, you know. You just get sick sometimes of trying to deal with all of this stuff. And I knew a lot of biologists who quit because they couldn't put up with it. I knew a couple of them that committed suicide. They got so bad off. The son-in-law of Ray Spears that had the bullet works in Lewiston, Idaho, he was a bird biologist in Washington State, and he could not take it. He went to these meetings, sportsmen's meetings, where they chastised him so bad he finally just quit and went back to Lewiston and went to work for his father-in-law. But you got to have a thick hide. You've got to realize that these people mean what they say. They're worried about things. They're concerned as they see it. You've got to be able to understand them well enough to be able to explain to them what the truth is without making them too mad. And at the same time, you've got to know what you're talking about. You can't give them baloney, because sooner or later they find out if you're just blowing wind at them. And I had a lot of that in Idaho. I'll never forget one of them. I went up to Kellogg. At that time, I was still living in McCall. And they had a big rod and gun club up there in the Coeur d'Alene Valley, which is a big mining area. And all these miners are a real tough bunch of elk hunters. You know, they hunted over mainly in the St. Joe drainage and the North Fork of the Clearwater. They decided that things were wrong with the elk in there, and they wanted somebody to come up and listen to them. So I got assigned to go up there. It was my management area. I faced a real angry, aggressive-looking crowd, and I thought, I'll be lucky to get out of here alive, you know. So I explained what we were doing and how we were doing it and why we were doing it and what we had observed in our studies of the elk. and that there are plenty of elk up there if only you guys will hunt for them right, you know. So I finally got to the end of it, and the question and answer time, and I answered a whole lot of questions. And finally this one guy got up. He was about, I'll swear, 7 feet tall, that wide, came up to the podium where I was at, and I thought, well, this is it. This is where I finally get taken out of it. You know, they got up there, they got behind the podium, and he started blowing bird calls, and he said, well, this is I forget what bird, tweet, 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 you know, and this is another bird. And then I could see all these faces in the audience all changing. They're all beginning to grin, you know. This is a village idiot in Kellogg, Idaho. I can't talk about it yet without laughing. But then came the coffee and donut times, and everything was all jolly, and they agreed, well, maybe we did have a point, you know. I felt like I was pretty darn lucky to get out of there. We had a legislator. At every session of the legislature, his wife sent him down to Boise, saying, now you're going to put a stop to dove hunting in this state, mourning dove. So he'd go down there and make his speech, and he wore a bow tie, and the sports writer in the Boise Statesman paper always made a joke about that bow tie. So one of the things I had to do is go visit that guy later and try to talk to him about the fact that there were far more doves than we were going to hurt in the population. This is something else that I always had to emphasize, no matter who I talked to. We're dealing with populations and their ecology, their adaptation to their ecosystem. And this is what management has to do, and this is what we have to know to be able to manage properly. And so I talked to that guy. Well, he says, those doves are so little. Why do you want to shoot something like that so little? I said, well, it's like this. They're darn good to eat. Well, but they're so little. Well, I said, well, you know, a shrimp isn't very big. How many shrimp do you eat at a time? I said, the oyster's only about so big, and one strip of bacon, and a cherry or a strawberry, they're only about that big. And he said, okay, you win. He said, I can't help it. He says, my wife says I got to do it, and if I'm going to have peace at home, I got to go down to the darn legislature and make my speech every year. But
it definitely sounds like it's a challenge as a wildlife professional, balancing management and research. It's the science
exactly.
part.
You've got to understand the research and what it does to give you the information that you need to have for your management planning and execution. The two are just two sides of the same coin. They're so interknit that it's very difficult for somebody to work in research without understanding how management might affect what he's interested in, and vice versa. Now, while I was still at the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit in Stillwater, the College of Engineering is building up quite a specialty in preparing engineering students to go into organizations that were doing development work. All kinds of new things were coming up, you know. At the same time, in our department, we were trying to get students trained, and educated, who could advise these people as to what it is you're going to do to this ecosystem, and here's what you ought to think about in modifying your planning to minimize that, you know. So one of the professors over there and I got together one day over at the faculty lounge and talking about this, you know, and Mulholland was his name. And I said, well, you know, it'd be good if we could get these students together. Okay, let's do that. And we sat down, we created an institute, an intercollegiate institute. We had engineering students coming over to our department and getting courses, and we had our guys going over there to the engineering college. And they set up some special courses, as we did, that enabled them to talk together. Had entirely different professional lingo, you know. We'd read something out of their place and they talk about all this stuff that meant nothing to us and vice versa. So we cooked up a lexicography so we'd understand each other's language. And I think that's still going as far as I know. But
So how did you get to Alaska?
well, the Fish and Wildlife Service that I mentioned, I went to Fort Collins, Colorado for, they set up a nationwide Office of Biological Services, specifically as an information generating and managing and transfer function. All the regions the regional offices got involved in this. And while I was still at Stillwater, and they contacted me about my interest in something like this. And I went back to Washington, D.C. 2 or 3 times from Stillwater and helped design this program, and especially as to what kind of people we should have in the regional office for an Office of Biological Services group. And we designed that. We also wrote up all of the position descriptions for each one of these. And then it finally came about. They wanted me to go to Alaska to set up the one up there. Well, I came up here in 1977 a few times, primarily to get started on setting up a computer center. Now, I had no knowledge about computers, but I knew how to look for people that did. And we already had some people up here that were beginning to work in that particular Office of Biological Service interest. So I did that in 77. Well, and then 78 moved up here. And by then my kids were all grown up and pretty much gone. So my wife and I came up and I got started. Right off the bat, I got hit with the fact that I'd been named the chairman of the Committee on Natural Resource Information Management in the Land Managers Cooperative Task Force. This was something that the governor and the Secretary of Interior's representative here got together and put together. All of the federal and state agency heads and also folks from the private land, primarily the native lands that they had gotten out of ANSCA. And they started trying to get together to get a better coordination of how land management and resource management on them should be coordinated in a way that we're not all going in different directions. Unfortunately, Governor Hammond and the Secretary of Interior's representative did not like each other. So there were some difficulties there, but I did not understand why I had been named the chairman of that committee before I even got up here, but then I soon found out it was because nobody else wanted it. I said, oh, well, what the heck, you know. Well, that turned out to be a pretty good deal. I got representatives from all these agencies, and one guy in particular, Bob Arnsdorfer from BLM, and I really hit it off good. And so we had periodic meetings. We'd get all these people together, and we'd bring in speakers or persons of interest who could clue us in on ways of doing things. We got acquainted with some folks from the Geological Survey who had the Landsat station back in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And Arnsdorfer and I got them to establish a branch out here where they brought in all their computers and stuff. They'd get the readings off the Landsat satellite, and those are converted into maps that were beautifully done. With the Burroughs computer system they had, they could blend colors and all. At the same time, we also got the NASA program up here to completely aerial photograph the whole state. They brought up that big jet airplane, I forget what they call it. The pilot was a woman, a lady pilot that got quite famous for her work with that. They fly these flight paths, and the cameras click, 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 and they put it all together, and we got real good color aerial photographs. It serves as a baseline, which then with the satellite imagery we would get periodically, we could see changes from that baseline.
Wasn't it U-2 spy planes they used too, or the U-2 airplanes?
Yeah, well, it wasn't a U-2, it was a modification of that. It was bigger than that U-2 in its construction. I think they called it a Blackbird, if I remember right. No, wait a minute, that was Blackbird, that was the night fighter they had at Leyte. I was in the Merchant Marine, I was at the invasion there when we took Leyte back from the Japanese, and they got to where the night air raids got to be pretty bad, and they brought in this night fighters. It looked like a big P-38 fighter, except they had radial engines, but it had the two twin tail booms that had two people, one of whom was a radio operator and gunner. They'd get behind the Jap airplane in the dark, and the first time I saw this, we were on air alert. We had up north of us. And I've been writing my autobiography at my family's insistence
Oh,
for
great.
years, and I've been spending quite a bit of time on my computer, and of course I've got recourse to a lot of letters I wrote home and to my wife, and a lot of other information that I've accumulated. So I do have a good way of referring back to the past, and as I have been doing this, I've been thinking more and more about my whole career, and how one thing has led to another, and how my comprehension has expanded, and also I think important to keep realizing how things have changed. Some of the fellows that I went to school with and got into the wildlife work, they sat in one job, same thing, year after year till they retired. And I would have gone crazy doing that. I've been all over with this job. I've enjoyed every bit of it. I've had very fortunate opportunities, but I took advantage of them. A lot of guys I know have had opportunities that, they didn't want to do it. They'd have to move or they'd have to do something else, and they didn't want to change. To me, it was all exciting adventure, every bit of it. And I've enjoyed meeting the people I've known. I've known a lot of very famous scientists because of this. And not that I had a whole lot to do with them, but at least I was able to talk to some of them and get their ideas and their philosophies. Certainly there's a great variation among all of us biologists. So oftentimes, we don't agree among ourselves. We may not agree with the animal rights bunch or some of the developers or somebody else, but here in the state we've had differences of opinion among our biologists as to predator control, for example. And you have to learn how to deal with that. You can't just ignore it. You can't just pretend like it doesn't exist. If you're going to do your own job well and be a responsible public servant, if you will, you've got to be able to interact with all of these different things effectively. You've got to be diplomatic, I guess, but not too far. Sometimes you've got to stand up and really speak your piece, which I have done over the years many, many times. Oftentimes got myself in hot water over it. But nevertheless, sometimes you've just got to stick up for strongly what you feel like is right. You get to the limit. But at the Western Energy Land Use Team, we looked into quite a variety of energy developments coming on the northern Great Plains. We're going into more strip mining and getting into lower grade coal. They're beginning to try to think up ways of using geothermal power and oil shale in western Colorado and Utah. There was a question of how water systems might be involved in this. For example, southern Colorado, one idea of the coal there was to grind it up very finely, mix it with water in a slurry, and build a big pipeline all the way back east and shoot that coal back there, dry it out, and burn it. It never got built, of course. But at any rate, these are some of the things that industry and these regulatory agencies that we would deal with, and other land management agencies, federal and state, really didn't have a good handle on. They had never faced up to the need to look at this in a comprehensive way to satisfy this environmental impact thing. So what we got into there at Fort Collins in the Western Energy Team was to start spreading the word that you've got to look at how these things interact. This laundry list approach with just naming everything doesn't tell us anything, except, we know these are the species that are going to be affected maybe by this, but in what way? How about it? And especially, what can we do then to restore that impacted land and put it back together? As time went by, we met up with a lot of people in the field where they were doing this stuff. Up in Wyoming, a coal development up there, for example. We found one coal mine up there that's spending something like $2,500 an acre to put their strip mine area back into production of some kind of vegetation. But what they were trying to do was get into real fancy stuff that they thought what people would like. We pointed out to them how they could put that back into just plain old weeds and brush for wildlife at about $250 an acre. Great. We're heroes, Stuff like this went on all the time. But mainly what we did, not only ourselves, but would contract out. We had about $6 million from the EPA to help develop this information. One of the things we developed was a system of effectively, systematically transferring this kind of information. The 5 steps. One of them is you get with the needful organization, identify the problem. And secondly, you then look for the literature and other information that is going to be useful. Third, you get all that stuff analyzed and understand what's good and what's not and get it put together. Fourth, you create the information package for that person and transfer it to them one way or another, workshops, films, whatever. The 5th step, then you go back and check to make sure that it's working right and that they know what they're doing with it. And we got computer science by then involved in a way that was quite helpful. So we did a lot of that all over the western states, and got also individual projects that we thought might be very helpful in this. Mine was to create a guidebook, and we contracted with an outfit right there in Fort Collins, Ecology. Forgot their name now. They were good. They were 3 professors from the university, Colorado State University, put that together, and it really took off. They're very honest, very capable, and if you spent $1 with them, you got $1 worth of value out of them. So we got together and we created a big guidebook, ecosystems approach to environmental baseline analysis. That thing really took off. They were reprinting it, 5 or 6 times. Universities all over were buying it for laboratory work. Other agencies were buying cases full of them. Our famous episode with that finally came about down in the Gulf State. The Fish and Wildlife Service, Ecological Services group that did the permitting, they'd examine a situation and then they would issue a permit from our point of view for the thing to go ahead, some kind of development. They would come back and examine it and make sure it was going okay, and if it wasn't, they'd shut it down or they'd make corrections. Well, there's a big lawsuit in court, and this developer had been taken into court by our Fish and Wildlife Service people and said, well, you did this wrong, you did that wrong, you did this other thing wrong. And the guy, the company guy held up our book. He says, well, we did it exactly the way your book here tells us how to do it. Our people didn't even know about it. Our people at that trial didn't even know about this. Really, the judge threw it all out. But
well, so we had you back in Alaska with the Biological Services of Fish and Wildlife and the Land Planning Committee.
What we did here in Alaska was create a kind of an extension of what we were doing there at Fort Collins. Information production. I had these different projects that I supervised. Each one had its own project leader. Environmental contaminants was one. In-stream flow analysis was one. Outer continental shelf oil development, coastal ecosystems. We had an information transfer specialist. We also had a remote sensing specialist. And so our team all worked together to develop the kind of information that people up here needed. We produced several guidebooks for the oil industry on removing gravel from streams on the North Slope to make drilling pads, for example. We did a lot of mapping of new areas coming out of Anilka, new refuge being made, new parks, what have you. All of the agencies up here got on the same kind of computer, got an Data General MV8000 system in practically every regional office. The information went on steel disks. We had moved on up from floppy disks and tapes to these steel disks stacked up that high. You needed tremendous capacity to hold all of the information from mapping. Computer cartography really got to be the big thing. So that was one of the things that my computer shop set up. That was another part of my program. They finally took it away from me. All over the United States, all the regional offices, the administration office, took over all of the computers. They started using them for all kinds of stuff, but other than what we wanted them for, we had a big fight over that. At any rate, we worked a lot with quite a few different private companies up here, the environmental consulting companies primarily, oil industry with the loggers, with miners, everybody that was about to do something that had to have a environmental impact analysis. We were busily digging up Alaskan information as well as general scientific information, putting it into these packages of one thing or another that would help them be able to do their job without getting into trouble.
And what years were you doing this?
Well, from 78 through 86, I retired, and from the federal service. I then went into, or 85 it was, I'm sorry, 85. I went into private consulting, as well as doing adjunct teaching at both of the campuses. I taught basic ecology courses, and Alaska Pacific University had me do one on Alaskan outdoor type stuff for the benefit of teachers who were wanting to upgrade their degree, get a master's degree so they could get a better pay rate and all. So I taught that course. I went over quite a bit of the different ecosystems of the state and things that affected them and things that were important in them, and also brought in a lot of anthropology, which has always been a kind of a side interest of mine. Still is, in fact. I read a lot of things about anthropology, primarily now from the standpoint of how DNA analysis is affecting our understanding of evolution of not only people but animal life in general. And in fact, I probably spend more time reading that sort of thing now than I do anything about wildlife. Although I still keep pretty active with the state and try and get these wood bison back into the state. That's kind of in limbo. But after I retired out of the Fish and Wildlife Service and then was doing this teaching and environmental private consulting, the oil spill hit.
That's the Valdez oil spill?
The Exxon Valdez oil spill, right. And that's when I ran into this friend of mine at the gym that said, hey, state wants a guy to go over to Valdez and supervise the crew over there because nobody else wants it. It was not the sort of thing a younger person would see as something great on their career ladder, you know. And to me, it was a great opportunity to go back and see something else. And when I retired out of the Fish and Wildlife Service, I must say this. I felt lost. I felt very bad. I felt guilty that from what I know and what I can do and what I've done and what I should be doing, if I really believe in all of this, I still should be doing something, you know. And so that's why I got into the consulting, which I didn't like. I met so many of the private consultants who were being hired to help somebody avoid the regulations and the requirements, how to get around all that rather than how to comply with them. And that turned me off. And I consulted to one guy who's going to build a big tourist lodge up near the park. He had a lot of Australian money that he was spending on that. He was also going to put in a big theme park up Portage Creek. But the Australians went bankrupt and he lost out on that. That was about the time that the oil spill hit. So I came into the office here. I met with Mark Kuwata. I don't know if you know Mark, of course. He was pretty much in charge of the thing over there at Valdez. And I told him who I was and what I'd been and everything. He practically grabbed me by the collar and said, how soon can you go over there? So I went home and loaded up some stuff, got on an airplane, went over there. And that was an extremely interesting experience from the standpoint of how these different agencies were all trying to cut each other's throat. Exxon and the Coast Guard and a lot of the other agencies were trying to deal with this thing in a way that made them look good, without at the same time really getting into some of the nitty-gritty of what should be done. I'll admit, they were doing a heck of a job in trying to clean up the oil, but there were things that needed to be understood and ready to be done after that. Exxon was putting out a beautiful big pamphlet, a magazine practically, telling all the wonderful ways that they were dealing with the oil spill. charts and graphs and all this stuff about safety records and training and all that, but not a darn bit of information in there as to exactly how what they were doing was interacting with the environment, with the ecosystem, especially the intertidal areas. So this was the kind of stuff. We had big meetings all the time. They'd get the big meeting room up there, and there'd be a lot of yelling and shouting and accusations and complaints. And a lot of the environmental groups were up there too. They got a big kick out of listening to all this, of course. I had a lot of trouble with the Coast Guard. I had always thought of the Coast Guard and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as being something really superb and up there, noble and all this stuff. I'll be very honest. I'll tell anybody this face to face. I was tremendously disappointed with what the Coast Guard did over there. And we finally got to one meeting where the Admiral, Robbins was his name, and made some highly critical comments about what we were doing, Fish and Game Department. And my response was, well, it'd be very, very admirable if the Admiral would only do justice by the coastal ecosystem of Alaska instead of all this crap you've been doing. Well, they'd already got one guy fired, the state guy that was over there. He mouthed off a lot, and he got canned out, but they didn't do anything to me. I don't know why. I guess it's kind of toward the end of it all. They figured, what the hell's the use? Not much to fight about now. But that finally played out over there, and we brought a lot of it back here to Anchorage and worked on it for quite a while. Still had a whole lot of big arguments and disagreements with them all. And I finally thought, well, I'm going to go back into retirement. Well, about that time, wait a minute, somebody says, we got this other thing we'd like for you to do. The State Supreme Court had upheld what was called the Osachek case. Outfitter and guide and lodge owner over west could not get a permit from the state to have big game hunting right around where his lodge was. Some other guide already had that area. And he went to court that saying that that should not be allowed, that should not be restricted like that. So the thing was all fought out in court, and the Alaska Supreme Court then said, okay, go back to the drawing board here, go back to square one, look at the whole thing, revise these as you see fit, and try to figure out some way to correct this situation. What had gone on before was that the old game board was all a good old buddy bunch. They had everything already set up the way that a lot of the guides wanted it, and they didn't want to change it. So under the law that was then passed, had an entirely new board established, the Big Game Commercial Services Board, and a whole lot of new stipulations came in that, for one thing, a guide had to reapply for his permit, his area permit, every 5 years. And that would depend on having a good record, of course. If he could show that he really did a good job, he could get a renewal. But if any areas opened up, then there's the opportunity for a new guy to come in. So I had done a lot of work with the guides and outfitters in Idaho, and I had a pretty good idea how they thought, what they needed, and what the public needed, also insofar as the quality of their services. And so the lady that was in charge of that, Suzanne Miller, says, it's only going to be about 6 months, Okay, so I took it on. 3 years later, finally got it all done. Ready.
You were setting up the system for guides, for managing the guides?
Some of it was restrictions. It was to go over all of the guide areas. There's quite a number of guide areas in the state. They are, in turn, portions of the game management units. And this, we finally broke down to where we have what were called uniform coding units, small areas based on a local ecology and game population or complex of game. And when the hunters would report their kill each year, they would report where they were. We would just tie that to one of those UCUs, uniform coding units. This then gave us a composite view of the distribution of harvest. Of course, you have to realize that a lot of hunters don't give you the straight scoop. They don't want to tell you where they hunted because they don't want anybody else to know about it. But we kept promising this information is not going to be something that will be tied to your name or whatever, that it's going to be very valuable for management. You know, it turned out to work pretty good, and they still use it. But we had to work a lot with the federal land management agencies that permit hunting. Park Service allows hunting on their preserves, you know. Wildlife refuges have hunting. Forest Service, the BLM, the State Department of Natural Resources manages the state areas. All of these people have their own regulations about how things are to be done. A guide not only has to get the state's assignment to a hunting area, he has to get a commercial use permit out of that landowner. And that led to a lot of complications that had to be straightened out. But we finally got to the end of that, and I was ready to quit again and go back. Oh, wait a minute, we got this other thing we'd like for you to do. So that's when I got into the Habitat Division. The Wildlife Conservation Division. I had been in the Habitat Division with the oil spill work. But when I got over to working with the guide thing, with Suzanne Miller on that, I realized that there was an awful lot of things going on with hunting and guiding and how we're managing land here that is quite affected by, other than just rules and regulations of the agencies, that there's a much broader public interest here. And I had thought about this over my whole career, that every time I jump, there's a whole new ball game of what people do and want to deal with. And that in this subsistence thing that the federal government had cooked up, because of another lawsuit, that when the ANILCA was passed, and it's Title VIII of ANILCA requires that rural people have preference for hunting and fishing, and just hunting at that time when it started, that 40 million acres of private land in the state that the natives manage has quite an important role in this. The natives also have access to a lot of federal land and state land. Well, this lawsuit said that this restricting the hunting opportunity only to these rural people violates the state constitution. And therefore, the state should not comply with the federal dictate on this. So when the state refused to do so, then the federal people said, okay, we'll set up our own hunting regulations, which they have done. In a lot of ways, they overlap or duplicate the states, but in other areas, they have created these special circumstances that either exclude or highly restrict non-subsistence qualified people, that is federally non-subsistence. State also has a subsistence program on its own land, and sometimes that overlaps or it's next to each other. And we began to see that the local rural people could get a federal permit to hunt with their style, their system, at the same time then get the state permit, and they're getting more hunting opportunity than the rest of us. Well, of course, they justify that in terms of need, that subsistence gathered food is extremely important over over most of the state. Those of us who have worked with this and reacted with it, I know 100% of us feel like people who really need subsistence should get it, but not the way that the federal system works. They've just blocked out whole areas, whole villages and all, regardless of whether somebody living there really needed it. This is particularly true with federal people. We had a big stink over at King Salmon when the Air Force used to have a base there. And anybody could come in from Texas, had never seen a moose or a caribou before in his life, plunks him down there, he's subsistence qualified for a federal subsistence license. But Section 804 of ANILCA says that a person who's going to be qualified for that federal subsistence there has to have lived there, has to have lived the subsistence lifestyle, has to depend on that food as their primary source of food. They have to follow certain other ways about how they handle all that. Well, those Air Force guys and Fish and Wildlife Service people over there that based on the refuge and all, they didn't have to do that. They got food at the store quite readily or shipped it over from Anchorage. They hadn't been there all their life hunting subsistence. And that got to be a thorn on the side of a lot of non-federally qualified subsistence hunters. So we had an awful lot of things to work out there, and I represented the state then to the Federal Subsistence Board, which would meet periodically. They in turn had all these regional councils who would come up with requests and suggestions, the problems and all. They would make a proposal and bring it to the board meeting to get that approved. Well, there were a lot of things done that were, and the state laws would say one thing, but the Federal Subsistence Board would ignore them. For example, in southeastern management units, the state outlawed shooting at deer from boats because it began to realize what a high wounding rate it was causing. The deer would come right down on the shoreline at times to get food. The guys would cruise along in their boat, and the boat would be bobbling all around and shoot at a deer. They might get it, and they might not. Well, the feds gave in to a request from local people down there, federally qualified subsistence hunter, to allow them to shoot from boats again. And we complained that, looky, those boats are inside the 3-mile limit. They're in state water. Those deer are on state land in some cases because they're below the high tidal mark. That's not Forest Service anymore. So what? They went right ahead and proved it anyway. We gave them a request for reconsideration and asked them to change it, and they turned us down. Dozens of times that happened. But it finally got to where I was putting up with so much lying and cheating and God only knows what else in the way of ideas to get around the law. And I got to thinking, well, this is it. This is the end. And I finally went into retirement. But I got pretty active then in the Safari Club International that I had enlisted to help me with a lot of this previously, getting support on some of this stuff. And they said, well, by golly, we're going to sue the feds over this subsistence thing. And somebody gave them the idea that we better stick with Morrison on getting the information for this because he's the guy that knows it. Well, I did. I had not only a whole lot of records of my own, but also I had access to all the records still existing here. Tina Cunning, of course, who worked with that pretty heavily from the legal aspects, she had all that stuff on file too, which I had access to because it's public information, of course. So I picked out all the goodies that would really count in court, and it finally came out that the judge did not accede to all requests that they go back and cancel all the existing federal regulations and make them start all over again on a more realistic, honest basis. But he did make them change their council memberships so that somebody who was not a locally qualified, federally qualified subsistence hunter could be on one of those councils. And in fact, I think it required a certain percentage of the council membership had to be people like that, so that their voices would be heard in representing those of us who are not federally qualified. So I still work with the state in this wood bison reintroduction project, as well as still help the Safari Club International has quite a strong conservation program, and they hand out grants for research and management studies and educational programs on wildlife all over the world. An international organization, and they wanted to get a review board put together to look at these proposals more realistically. And I made quite a catalog of the names of people all over the world that they could contact for specific kinds of knowledge and experience. And they could be asked to serve as a judge of a proposal for something that's going to affect the area that their expertise in or land area they're familiar with. But even that's kind of quieting down. I'm just getting to the point now where I'm not all that energetic.
Well, the subsistence debate has been going on in Alaska for a long time, and it's very complicated.
Yeah.
And I've never quite understood how it all balances out with federal management on state lands. It sounds like it was very
A certain amount of accommodation finally came about. One big problem we had was, they'd been putting muskox on the Seward Peninsula for several years. The State Fish and Game Department, with the use of the federal aid money, the Pittman-Robertson Act money, a tax on firearms and ammunition and all that's then parceled out to the states for use in wildlife work. They had paid to move a bunch of muskox from St. Lawrence Island over to the Seward Peninsula and get new population started there. It finally grew up to where it was big enough to start having some hunting on. So the state said, okay, we're going to have, I forget how many permits, and half of them they'll all be on a special permit drawing basis, for Alaska residents, and there'll be some for non-residents. Well, some of the subsistence users out there said, well, we want them all. So they went to the Federal Subsistence Board, and darn if they didn't get the Federal Subsistence Board to say, okay, I think it was 15 permits or something like that. All 15 muskox available, we're going to issue federal permits for. Well, that puts the state on the spot that we can't give out 15 permits or we're going to be killing twice what the biologists figure we can safely take. The amount of federal land out there is minuscule compared to the amount of state land, and the state land's where the muskox always usually hung out. So what are you going to do? Feds didn't care. Okay, they'll give them those permits, and if the muskox get over on the federal land, then they're fair game. And that's the way it's going to be. So we kept the interaction going and kept talking and talking. All finally, after I had retired, they got together and worked out some kind of a compromise that I'm not sure yet. I never did really go back and look at it. I was so fed up with it all. I figured, well, maybe they'll come to some kind of a worthwhile conclusion. And pretty good example of some of the things that a biologist is going to have to learn to deal with. And I go back to what I said a while ago, is that you've got to learn to deal with populations of animals. You've got to learn to deal with the public. You've got to really learn ecology. In my own academic development, I had a tremendous amount of coursework that I don't think a lot of the newer youngsters are coming out with. A lot of math, a lot of chemistry, a lot of physiology, a lot of behavior. This is all the way up through my PhD program. Genetics, embryology, endocrinology. All of these kind of things are important. To understand how animals adapt to their ecosystems, to understand how plants are affected by different things. What do plants need? What are the values of plants, either as cover or as food? Protective cover, for one thing, also protecting the soil from erosion. When I was at Oklahoma in the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit, one other thing I did there, I cooked up the first annual bobwhite quail symposium. A lot of states have quail hunting. A lot of research and literature existed by then, but not a whole lot of interaction had been done on a broad scale to help everybody understand what everybody else's problems were and needs and what could be done, technology. And one of the things we cooked up for our symposium, I had a lot of guys helping me, of course, visited a ranch that way out west in western Oklahoma, field trip. And so we went out there, and a lot of other ranchers came because they knew this was going to be on this one ranch. And a lot of them said, gee, we want a lot more quail. What do we do to get quail? Well, what do you got on your land? Oh, we got lots of cattle. What else? Well, lots of cattle. A few oil wells. That's called an improved pasture. And so I went and looked at some of them, and they're just eating down into the ground. I said, you got nothing left here but mallet grass. Well, what's mallet grass? This is something I'd heard in Montana years ago. Well, your grass is eaten down, so you got to take a mallet and pound the ground all around it so the cow can get it. This didn't go over very well either. But at any rate, I pointed out to him that what quail need is not a lot of bare ground or weeds of that nature. The good stuff had all been overgrazed. You wonder, well, how did they raise decent cattle when there was so badly overgrazed in there? But what they did, they just kept reducing the number of cows, of course. Quail need a whole lot of mixture of stuff, and this is true of a lot of wildlife. They need different kinds of habitat parcels to do different things in. And the more mixture you can get, the better. You could say, well, you've got this patch of weeds to feed in, and this patch of brush to hide out in, and this over here for something else, and over here, and they'll all meet. Well, if they needed some of all that, you only got one place where they could really hang out, and the rest of it's all waste. So the old-time farming, mixed farming, was, of course, where a lot of wildlife was best suited to. When they started all this even age stuff, clean farming they call it, single species stuff, right up to the edge of the asphalt on the road, there's not much there for wildlife.
You had talked about in your career you've moved around and you've taken your wildlife background and applied it to, policy positions and
Right.
and other things like that. Is that unique, do you think, or do you think lots of people do that switch from
It's
the
not a
more
broad-based
field
sort of thing. It depends on exactly what part of wildlife work you get into. As I mentioned, we had set up those 3 different bachelor's curricula at Oklahoma. Somebody that's in law enforcement, for example, still has to have a pretty good understanding of wildlife ecology. Certainly not the depth of it that a guy in research would, or somebody that's really into intensive management. But he has to be able to talk to the public too.
Mm-hmm.
I had to work law enforcement in Idaho. All the biologists had to carry a badge. We were required, if we saw something that needed attention, it was part of our duty to do it. I arrested several guys in different things, and they were always quite surprised that when I showed up. I suppose that happens to all of the law enforcement officers, but to me it was kind of unique.
How did your family handle all that moving around, and how did you balance?
They got through it fairly well. There were problems because it's best for kids, I think, to be able to grow up with a good bunch of kids all the way through teenage. My kids didn't enjoy that. They had some benefit, for example, in going to Puerto Rico for a couple of years. They went through high school in Stillwater. The high school was not up to my standards. For example, the high school coaches were all supposed to teach certain courses. They would come in, they'd turn on the TV set, and they'd take off to drink coffee and come back when the hour was up, and the kids were in there doing all kinds of things other than watching the TV. I got this from my own kids now. My oldest son had to take the same English course twice because they required X number of hours in English, but they didn't have enough English courses to fill it all out. So by getting into that same class twice, he was then able to get the number of hours. They had another program called distributive education, and everybody was required to take a class in that. Well, what it amounted to, they had to go out and get a part-time job, and they got pumped full of all of this commercial stuff. They had an oath about improving my own benefit or something. I forget the words of it, but it was just plain greed is what it amounted to. And I went to the North American Wildlife Conference in Houston in 1969, I think it was. And they were having their convention in the same hotel that we were having the North American Wildlife Conference in. There's a huge hotel down there. And here are all these high school kids flocking in, big banners and all this, and distributive education. And they had these guys getting up and really ramming them about what they have to do to make sure that I get mine. That's about what it amounted to. I thought it was really dumb.
Well, let's go back to the overview of your career. And you say it's been very diverse. When you look back over it, do you have 2 or 3 things that you think you really accomplished and you've contributed?
I guess the thing that I really felt the best about were my graduate students. The fact that I was able to convey to them some of what I had learned and do it in a way that really enabled them to move on in a good way. All my graduate students got into really good work, and they often, for some years afterward, I'd hear from them and they would express a lot of gratitude about it. one of them that did his master's with me went on and did a veterinary doctor degree back east, and he's now the chairman of the veterinary school in the University of Kansas and Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. He's a department chairman there. He did a lot of work with birds. His study with me was on mourning doves. And he also, as a sideline, the guy was so bright and all, he kept working with some folks in the veterinary school with some poultry questions while he was still working on his master's degree. And he did some work in cooperation with the federal disease control place in Atlanta, Georgia. But then when he finished his DVM, he went on and did a PhD. For quite a long time, he was in charge of avian research at Fish and Wildlife Service Patuxent Wildlife Research Unit in Maryland, and he did a lot of work there on developing techniques and all to get condors to reproduce. The condors that had been put back into California that they're protecting, they were raised by Jim Carpenter's his name.
What about your work with the Exxon Valdez oil spill? Do you feel like you contributed to get the arguing to stop?
Well, I don't know that I contributed a lot. I guess contribute in the sense of having a real effect on what took place in the cleanup and all that. I was up against too much power there. They had a lot of orders from Washington, D.C. for one thing. The National Park Service was told to stay out of it, even though that oil was going all the way down through the Kenai Fjords National Park.
So you didn't step in and get them all to stop arguing and agree and get along?
No, I didn't jump in and argue with them, but we had one situation where my crew was coming back on one of the helicopters. We had dead loads of video cameras like yours. Now, they were spraying this chemical stuff that's supposed to dissolve the oil. They have a sheet that tells how that stuff is supposed to be applied by federal law. I forget the exact name of that sheet. But it tells all of the chemicals that are involved. It tells exactly how they are to be applied. And in the end, it's signed by the Coast Guard Admiral. So this stuff was supposed to be sprayed at a certain density per unit area of land. It was the crew spraying had to be covered with stuff that could not spray it on anything over a certain slope. I forget what all else was involved there, but it was pretty restrictive on how they applied that chemical. So here's this big boat they had, and these two guys were out on the front of it, and they were spraying this stuff like a fire hose up and down on this cliff. Well, there's slanted back a bit. Oh, I take it back. They were supposed to be in those protective suits, but they weren't. They were spraying far more on a piece of ground than they were supposed to. It was running down into the water, which it wasn't supposed to. In fact, it was a great big milky band. You could see it in the film. So at the next meeting with the Coast Guard, we showed them that and said, well, now here's the paper about how they're supposed to do this. And here's what we took a picture of. What are you going to do about it? Well, Admiral Robbins called us all a bunch of sons of bitches. In so many words, right out of that admiral's mouth. So we had a big set to about that. And just another example of the kind of stuff that, well, there was another little creek that came off of one piece of ground right across from the native village, Titlik, the new Titlik, which was a piece of beach where they dug clams and they got all kinds of stuff. There were fish in that creek. Exxon wanted to make that a study area and spray the whole thing with all kinds of stuff. And I went over there, I flew over to Titlik and talked to the folks, stayed there overnight to really get a good picture of it all. Went back and had it out with them over that, and I got that stopped. Then there was another creek on Night Island where the major spawning stream for pink salmon. And huge numbers of pink would come out of there. Well, the same darn thing they wanted to do there. They wanted to spray the whole beach. Why the whole beach, I don't know. And also up into this kind of a pool that came down at the bottom of that creek, choked with salmon fry coming down in the spring. So I got on the radio, and I radioed back to their boss, the guys that were getting ready to set this study up, you know. I called their boss in Anchorage on the radio and expressed what was going on, and told them I was going all out on that one, that they were not going to wreck that salmon spawning stream the way they were talking about doing. Got that stopped. But those are little side things that I was able to do by dealing with just a small group of people. You go to those big meetings where you got the head of the DNR there and the head of the Forest Service and all kinds of admirals and what have you. It's got to be a big rat race, a big circus.
Well, before we end, we had talked a little bit before about talking about your philosophy.
Right.
And I don't know how much we may have covered that. And your article about applied ecology, you might want to tell us what that's all
about. Yeah, if I tried to really pin it down, I'd say that my philosophy is all of our work as wildlife biologists and managers and what have you. Our first concern has to be with the wildlife and their habitats. Secondly, then we get concerned about what the general public wants in the way of recreational use. Third, then we should then consider commercial uses. We don't always get that, of course. The commercial uses and other public interests have far more influence with politicians than we often get. Another part of my philosophy is you cannot get enough good education to function in this job. You've got to be able to explain accurately and carefully what it's all about, and that we're talking about ecosystems. The public is a part of that system. Everything is a part of that system. And whatever we do and however we do it, we've got to have good ways of analyzing what's happening and interpreting what it will mean to the system as a whole. What are the key elements that you hit that are going to affect a lot of other things? There's a lot of interdependencies that are not fully thought out on a lot of these environmental impact analyses and in their statements. It also has to involve understanding how to restore some of this. It's all part of the game. You've got to play God, you might say, when they've turned something over, such as the ship coal mines they were doing in Wyoming. They take the topsoil off and lay it back. They get into the next layer and lay it back. They get down in the coal and haul it out, and they put everything back. Now, what do we do with the top of it? One area where they planted wheat on it. They got fantastic bushels of wheat per acre. But that would only last as long as they kept fertilizing it. And we convinced them, don't worry about commercial crops, put it back into wildlife habitat. And they did. One place where they made a big cut. And nobody in that whole part of Wyoming had ever seen cliff swallows before. It had not known to be there. But within a couple of years, somewhere or another came these cliff swallows and started digging their holes in that cut bank they'd made. Okay, let's protect that as it is, for Pete's sake. There's nothing there that you could change into something commercial value, you know. One of our, I'm digressing again, but another thing that came up in western Colorado, potential oil shale, contracted one outfit to rate what are the most important public interests there in the way of wildlife and the habitat and the environment there, you know. Well, at the top of the list, they put wild horses. Well, I tell you, the ranchers around there just went completely screaming mad. And we were all puzzled, you know. Paid these guys several $100,000 to come up with wild horses, which are terribly damaging to the ecosystems. But their rationale was, well, this is something that the whole country's interested in. You didn't say it was only supposed to be Colorado.
So your idea of applied ecology, that's what you're talking about you have to understand the whole system.
Exactly. You can learn a certain amount of wildlife from the standpoint of some of the institutions that had jumped in on the bandwagon when this got popular back in the 1970s. Every little college was putting in a wildlife program because they could get students to come. A lot of people were interested in getting into it. They'd say, okay, we got a wildlife program here. Let's come in and study it, you know, and they're turning out some real duds. They had some familiarity with biology there, of course, and a little bit of stuff about some management. Oftentimes their management was a personal reflection of somebody that was highly prejudiced one way or another. There's one outfit in California. My youngest son, Jim, went into the wildlife program in Fort Collins when we were there. And they went on a big field tour all over the West. They ran into this other group that was on a field trip out of some place in California. They started exchanging notes, and they were not alike. Ones from California were all animal preservationists, and they had all kinds of weird ideas about what wildlife work should be. At Stillwater, when we started up our bachelor's program and announced it as such, the first semester we had about 120 kids show up. We got them all into a room together in indoctrination, and Bob Smith and I, the wildlife teacher, explaining to them just exactly what we had to offer and where it fit in and what was out there that this would prepare them to work with, you know. Turned out about 2/3 of them had the idea, well, if I get in wildlife work, I'm going to handle bunny rabbits at the zoo, or I'm going to get into something like that place where they got all the porpoises jumping around. SeaWorld, yeah. All kinds of odd ideas. The idea of management that's involved with hunting, for example, and fishing and so forth. The idea of understanding more about how all this works together and how the public involves in it. That just doesn't register with them. To get involved in wildlife, you got to start off with a real burning interest to do something realistic. Of course, that's a personal opinion, what is realistic, and that's where we lost about 120 of those kids that started out, or I'll forget how many.
Well, looking back on your choice as choosing wildlife as your career, how do you feel about that choice?
About that?
Yeah, but you made the choice to do wildlife.
Oh, well, like I say, I started out when I was just a little kid, following my dad around rabbit hunting, and I got so interested in birds and all. It just kept growing. You
feel like it was a good choice?
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't have done anything else. And I'd still tell anybody that wants to get into this field that don't come in starry-eyed thinking you're going to do something to save the whale, and at that level of thinking, you know, that it doesn't involve a lot of demonstrations and putting up big arguments and what have you, unless you know what you're talking about. You've got to be rational. You've got to be able to get the public to support you. And one of the biggest problems we've always had is getting enough money and enough qualified personnel to do good work, meaningful work, productive work, that really serves the public's interest, whether they know it or not. It's been a long old time. As I say, I started my first class in Missoula in 1952. They were on a quarter system, and I started in January 1952. And all these years I've been working with it one way or another. How effective I've been, how productive I've been, how much good I might have done, I really can't say. I've had some places where I felt like I did accomplish something that improved things, but you can't do it just to satisfy your own desires, your own prejudices. You've got to learn what it's all about, and you've got to learn how to apply it. And you've got to have a sense of values about it that you'll stick up for, one way or another, either by contributing knowledge, by transferring information. The information transfer work that I got into there in Fort Collins and also up here, where you try to gather all that information that everybody's been involved with, and it's in all kinds of scientific publications, it's in all kinds of books, you know. There's tremendous amount of information out there, and another skill, another profession really, to investigate all that and pick out the good stuff and to know what is the good stuff and put it together in a format that you can then use effectively to influence somebody that really doesn't understand what it's all about. When I taught ecology at the campuses here, I was teaching out of the fort out at Elmendorf. I had Fort Rich soldiers also who had never had a course in biology. but they wanted to get a college degree, and I admired them for doing that, you know. So I was able to find a good textbook and a way of putting the information together that they didn't have to have a whole great depth of knowledge about biology, physiology, and stuff like that, botany. They were able to do pretty good at it, I thought. I was retired, of course, and I set up tutorials before and after class. I'd go out there early and have an hour that they could come in, because a lot of them had details and duties that made it tough for them to have the whole time they needed. I'd stay an hour after class. Then a lot of them would get sent out someplace else for several days, maybe even a couple of weeks. And I worked up a whole lot of stuff, Xerox, that I would hand out that would skeletonize, itemize what I was going to be talking about and the lectures they would miss. And they could take that with them. Then when they come back, they could say, they'd come to a tutorial and say, well, on this I hand out, you got this, what about it? And I would clarify things, amplify it. And they all gave me a real good rating when it was over with. The university, of course, asked them to fill out this form on what you're teaching like. So I felt pretty good about that. And like I say, with my graduate students that I taught, I just felt good that I could help somebody else understand what it's all about, and then maybe make good decisions when they vote or when they go talk to some decision maker in government, politics or whatever, that they would make intelligent recommendations that count, instead of going off screaming and howling and going down and burn somebody's research lab or whatever.
Well, we're just about out of tape. Unless we want to keep going, I think it's been enough. Is there anything else?
I don't know what else I could say.
Well, that was my question. Is there anything else?
Yeah. Get that education, learn about ecosystems. You can't just take a little piece at a time and ignore everything else, and you got to understand people.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. I very much appreciate it.
It's been a privilege.
It's
I've
been
really
fun
enjoyed
listening to you.
I always like to talk to wildlifers.